this podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
I have doubts about political theology.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
When I was a kid, there was a guy on late night local television, and he called himself Dr. Sanguinary. Or maybe it was Sam Guinary, I don't remember. Anyway, he dressed up like a monster. He had green paint on his face and airplane glue and all kinds of stuff to make himself look frightening. And then he played old horror movies from the 30s and made fun of them and things. And we used to stay up late at night and watch that. Well, the Heidelberg Reformation Association is now producing videos, Heidel videos, and we're releasing them on Fridays, and we're uploading them to YouTube. So it's not quite the same thing as Creature Feature, but it's close.
The Heidelcast.
Tish Harrison Warren, a priest, which is something that probably warrants its own podcast, but I'll let that go for the sake of this episode, in the ACNA, which is a denomination in the Anglican tradition, wrote in Christianity Today in 2020 or thereabouts, "We have an impoverished and inadequate political theology," she wrote. "It took us generations to get here, and this one election, regardless of the results, will not undo that. So, before we know who wins or loses, we as a church must begin to re-examine how the good news of Jesus shapes us politically." I don't disagree entirely with the main thrust of Warren's essay that the visible church forms a sort of alternative society. There are, however, some problems in the argument that need to be criticized and distinctions that need to be made. It seems to be a given now that there is such a thing as, quote, political theology, close quote, or that Orthodox Christians ought to have one. Certainly, this is the major premise of Warren's argument, and we'll consider how to define this term in a bit. Her minor or middle premise is that the church has always been a political entity, and I quote her again. "The early church aids us in this task. Early Christians used the word ecclesia, a term used for the assembly governing Greek city-states, to describe their own gatherings. This terminology highlights how the early church understood itself as a political body. But this strange new Christian assembly proclaimed that they were citizens of a different kingdom with a different king. It wasn't just a pious idea, it shaped them into a people who, in the words of Peter Leithart, embodied an," and she quotes him to say, "unprecedented social and political form," close quote. That, quoting again, "burst the bonds of all prior political categories," close quote. To buttress her argument, she appeals to what she describes as a, quote, "third century text," close quote, the Epistle to Diognetus. And again, I will come back to this in a minute. And there are some issues with this quotation that I just read, and we'll probably come back to this too, but the term ecclesia almost certainly wasn't borrowed from Greek city-states. It's the term used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is known as the Septuagint, to translate the assembly, the covenant assembly in the Old Testament, the kahal, and so ecclesia simply translates kahal. That's the frame of reference. I think that's a bad assumption on Warren's part. And then also, I think we should doubt her claim very much that the treatise to Diognetus, usually described as an epistle, but it's not that. It's from the 3rd century. It's not. It's from the middle of the 2nd century. But as I say, we'll come back to that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
The Heidelcast.
Warren doesn't define for us what she means by political theology, and I confess that I struggle with this term. In traditional Reformed use, following the broader Christian tradition, theology, broadly defined, refers to what God has revealed about himself, us, sin, Christ, salvation, church, sacraments, and last things, and sometimes Christian ethics. Narrowly, theology proper is the study of what God has said about himself. Politics, broadly as I understand it, is the art, not the science, and I say that as one who has a degree in political science, of believers and non-believers living together in our shared secular community. It's an important aspect of life, but it's just one aspect of life. More narrowly, which is the way the word is most often used, politics refers to partisan politics, that is, the contest between parties for influence and control over the levers of civil authority and civil power. What does it mean when we qualify theology, then, with the adjective political? Are there other spheres of life with which we can modify theology? Let us say that Abraham Kuyper, who lived from 1837 to 1920, was correct, as I think he was, that there are essentially three spheres in life: family, church, and state. For the sake of discussion, let us further agree with Johannes Althusius, who lived from 1557 to 1638, that the family is the most basic unit of society. If political theology considers theology of human, social, civil life together, is there a theologia familiae, a theology of the household, and an ecclesiastical theology? Well, of course, we already have this in existing categories. Church is already a topic of theology. The family is a topic of Christian theology under creation and theological anthropology, as well as Christian ethics. Christian theologians have long considered what we now call political theology under the same headings. And that's true of what we might call a theology of the family. In a sense, as my colleague David Van Drunen says in Politics After Christendom on page 17, the family is a polis. And, for that matter, so is the church. Thus, we could lump all three spheres under political theology, but that would not be very helpful. Properly, then, we should refer it to our shared common life together under the general providence of God, under his moral, natural, or creational law. By contrast, Warren moves from partisan politics, with which she begins her essay, to the broader definition, under which she seems to include the visible church. This makes a muddle and endangers the nature and mission of the church. Christians often use the word church ambiguously. Most often, particularly among evangelicals, it is used broadly to mean Christians considered collectively, without reference to the visible institutional church. This is because most evangelicals have a low view of the institutional church because they've been taught the old German kerygma to dogma model. The apostolic and early post-apostolic church was a dynamic, charismatic, unstructured association organized around a message and a Messiah, and only later became an organized institution with fixed dogmas. In fact, the history is rather different. The church was organized from the very beginning. It had dogmas from the beginning. It had a message from the beginning. The apostolic age did come to an end, a fact with which some have always struggled, for example, the Montanists and the Pentecostals. But the visible institutional church established by Christ continued. Mainly, Warren seems to use the word church in the institutional sense. Thus, her attempt to leverage the definition of ecclesia with the pagan secular usage is ill-advised, untenable, and should be rejected. It simply doesn't follow, and there is no evidence that the apostles or early post-apostolic church intended ecclesia in Christian use to mean what it meant in secular usage. The sense of the New Testament use of ecclesia was no more determined by the pagan use than John's use of logos, the word in John 1:1-3, was determined by its use among Stoics and Platonists. Rather, as I already said, ecclesia, as used in the New Testament, has to be understood against its background in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It translates, as I mentioned, the Hebrew noun kahal, which stands for covenant assembly. And this is how it's used in the New Testament. And if you want, I can point you to more resources on that, and I'll do that at the end of this episode. The effect of defining ecclesia in terms of the pagan usage is to turn Christ's church into something it isn't, an institution to effect social outcomes. Remarkably, in defense of her thesis, she appeals to what she described as a 3rd century text, the Epistle to Diognetus. I know that Bart Ehrman says that it might be dated as late as the 3rd century, but most scholars consider it a mid-2nd century text, and there are good reasons for that. Most of them internal, but nevertheless good reasons. There's much we don't know about this text. We don't know who wrote it. About 15 different authors have been proposed. We don't know to whom it was written, that is, who Diognetus was. The author simply calls himself a disciple. it seems likely that Diognetus was an influential figure, perhaps someone, as I think, in the Roman government. And it also seems likely that this text is really not an epistle at all, but it was an apologetic and persuasive treatise, and perhaps the record of an address given to this official to explain to this pagan Roman official what Christianity is and is not, specifically that it's not Judaism and it's not paganism. Whoever gave this speech or sent this treatise was bold indeed, since it is most likely that the hearer or recipient was a pagan. The author's critique of paganism is worthy of Isaiah and was probably influenced by the prophets. We know from the treatise that Diognetus wanted to know about the political agenda of the Christians. In the ancient pagan world, a state religion was assumed. The Christians had a religion, thus they must necessarily have had a civil political agenda. Also, that was the assumption. And the author wrote and or spoke at length to disabuse Diognetus of this assumption. He explained that Christians live in two cities simultaneously. He was echoing Paul in Philippians 3:20 by arguing that our fundamental citizenship is in heaven. The author wanted Diognetus to know that, in the sense in which Diognetus was thinking about politics, the Christians were no political threat to the established order. That's the point of chapter 5 of the treatise. So, when Warren says that prayer and fasting are, quote, inherently political acts, close quote, she does what the treatise to Diognetus did not do. She turns that which was intended to be sacred into something secular. She does this because her analysis lacks some important distinctions. Politics, and this is really, really important, so I hope you'll hear me on this. That's an actual cowbell. A real live, one of several now in the Heidelcast studios. Anyway, I hope you'll hear me when I say this. Politics belongs to nature, not to grace. That is, it belongs to creation, not to redemption. Politics belongs to law and not to gospel. Politics belongs to the secular. And by that, I do not mean that over which God has no authority. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just using secular in distinction to sacred, the way that our Reformed theologians used to speak all the time. Most evangelicals, however, lack these traditional Christian categories, and thus for them, everything has to be organized and considered under the categories of grace and redemption. So they're always speaking about redeeming this or that. We see this confusion when Warren asks us to consider how the good news of Jesus shapes us politically. Well, what if the good news of Jesus does not shape us politically?
Call or text now 760-618-1563.
That is just the point of the distinction that the treatise, the author to Diognetus, was making. By opting out of the state religion, we Christians were not making a political statement. We were creating, as Darrell Hart and others have argued, a new category, the secular. We were saying that we want to be good Roman citizens or resident aliens insofar as creational or natural law requires. But our religious commitments require us to draw certain lines. We may eat food offered to idols so long as the meal is not a religious, cultic meal. You can see 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 22. The Romans hated this distinction, and they killed us for it. They demanded conformity to the status quo. They called Christians haters of humanity for daring to opt out of polytheism and out of the Roman civil religion. But we did it anyway, but not to make a point about the Roman political system. Insofar as the Roman government enforced natural law, see Romans 13, it was doing what God appointed it to do. Thus the apostles commanded us to honor the emperor. See 1 Peter 2:17. We prayed for the civil governors who persecuted and martyred us. See 1 Timothy 2:2. Those prayers were not a political statement. Just as evangelicals seem to be able only to discuss politics under the heading of grace, so too they seem increasingly unable to discuss theology without the heading of politics. We ought to resist the cultural trend of politicizing everything, even if we're using the word politics in the broad sense. Not everything is about our common life together. So this is the source of my discomfort with the category political theology. What if theology is sacred and not secular? What if it doesn't need to be made secular in order to be made important? The early Christians who lived under pagan rule didn't speak much about political theology, nor did they portray every act of devotion as a political act. Our acts of devotion are not more or less significant because of what they say about or to the pagan world around us. They are significant precisely because our first citizenship is in heaven. So it's not true to say, as Warren does, quoting here, the good news of Jesus shapes us politically, close quote. Without a doubt, the good news of Jesus shapes Christians. That Jesus was raised from the dead, and that in his vindication we are justified before God, and that we've been saved by grace alone, sola gratia, through faith alone, sola fide. It means everything. It is truly life-determining. I love my neighbor out of gratitude for the Son of God who loved me from eternity, who became incarnate for me, who obeyed for me, who was raised for me, and who is coming again. It's true that the good news is that Jesus is coming again to consummate his kingdom, and that every knee shall bow, but the good news is not political. To say that the good news shapes us politically is to confuse the law and the gospel. God's moral, creational, and natural law shapes our politics, that is, how we live together in a shared secular society with each other and even with unbelievers. The law of God teaches us how to love our neighbors as ourselves. The gospel of grace empowers us to do it, but it's the wrong category to use here. If one dissents from Warren's application of the gospel to politics, even in the broad sense of the word, is one denying the gospel? Making these distinctions, for example, law and gospel, nature and grace, sacred and secular, is important because it preserves Christian liberty. Calvin said that we live in a twofold kingdom, a duplex regimen, or an administration of God's providential government of the world, the sacred and the secular. You can see this in Institutes of the Christian Religion 3:19-15. Should Christians think of the church as an alternative polis? Yes, certainly. It is, as an institution, the embassy of the kingdom of God. Ministers serve King Jesus. But the church's message is not cultural or political, even in the broad sense. The church's message is to announce the law and the gospel purely, to administer the holy sacraments purely, and to use church discipline. These are the marks of the true church, according to Belgic Confession, Article 29. The mission of the church is not to affect the culture, that's transformationalism, or to effect a culture, that's reconstructionism. Those things may be a byproduct of fidelity to the mission. It has been so. But it's not our goal. And when it has become our goal, we've lost our mission and our message. As citizens of a twofold kingdom, Christians as individuals and in groups do seek to engage the culture faithfully, graciously, and intelligently. Our citizenship in the heavenly city should be evident to all. But since we are citizens of a twofold government, let us not confuse the two, lest the church become just another interest group.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.